Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that feels more like a confession than a story. I'm sitting here with the lights low, the air thick with that strange calm that follows chaos. You know the kind, the moment when everyone's left your house but their words still echo off the walls. Tonight's story starts with a box, a very heavy one. Inside it was something that shouldn't have scared me, but it did. My husband's portrait. He had commissioned it just a few months before he passed, and when the courier dropped it at my door, my heart sank. Not from grief, I had already cried every tear I could, but because of what that painting might reveal. You probably won't survive this story emotionally, because it's about how a single silent face on canvas managed to destroy what death had already begun. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to watch the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's comfortably embark on tonight's journey. The box sat in the living room for 3 days before I opened it. I kept walking around it like a dog sniffing a stranger. My son told me I was being dramatic. Maybe I was, but when you've been married for 32 years and your husband dies suddenly, every leftover object feels like a test. People always debate whether grief dulls or sharpens the senses. I can tell you it sharpens. You notice everything, the smell of the tape, the tiny scuff on the floor, the chill coming from nowhere. When I finally peeled back the wrapping paper, the air shifted. The portrait was breathtaking and disturbing all at once. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, the one we had argued over because it looked too old-fashioned. His eyes were painted with this unsettling clarity, almost reflective. The painter had captured something beyond realism. It was as if my husband were staring straight at me, still disappointed about something I hadn't yet done. There's a funny thing about art and family dynamics. I once read that portraits are psychological mirrors. What you see says more about you than about the subject. So maybe it wasn't his expression that was judging me. Maybe it was my own guilt bouncing back. But from the moment I hung that painting in the hallway, the energy of the house changed. It wasn't paranormal, not exactly just a new kind of silence heavier than before. The first time my daughter saw it, she laughed nervously and said, "Mom, that's creepy. He looks alive." I laughed too, but it came out wrong, more like a cough than amusement. My daughter had always been the logical one, the type who saw emotions as messy. Yet even she couldn't look at that painting for more than a few seconds. Later that night, when everyone had gone home, I turned off the lights and caught a glimpse of his silhouette reflected in the window. For a second, I swore his lips looked different, less neutral, more knowing. I told myself it was the lighting. Shadows play tricks right still. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing the clock tick in the hallway, each sound syncing with the imagined rhythm of his breathing. People say widows sometimes lose touch with reality after losing a partner. But the real madness is how memory invades your ordinary life. You start seeing meanings in everything, the way the lamp flickers, the sound of wind in the vents, the portrait's unblinking gaze. I caught myself apologizing aloud to it more than once. "I'm doing my best," I whispered. "You'd be proud of me." But the strangest thing happened on the 4th day. My son dropped by with his wife. He had always been the practical one, proud of being realistic, as if feelings were a weakness. When he saw the portrait, he frowned and muttered, "That's not Dad. He looks angry. Angry." The word hung in the air. I looked again, and yes, there it was. The mouth, once serene, now looked ever so slightly tightened, the eyes somehow darker. I blinked, shook my head, and laughed it off, but inside, my stomach twisted. How could paint change? People still debate whether our minds project our guilt onto the lifeless or if the lifeless absorbs it. Maybe both. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat across from the portrait as if expecting it to speak. "If you have something to say, just say it," I whispered, half joking, half pleading. Nothing. Only silence, the kind that stretches too long. Then, as the old house creaked, I noticed one odd detail, a faint signature in the bottom corner, one I hadn't seen before. Not the artist's name, but 2 initials. His, my husband's. That discovery jolted me. He wasn't a painter. He could barely draw a stick figure. So why would his initials be there? Maybe he'd added it before delivery, maybe as some kind of message, or maybe I was losing it. I leaned closer and realized the letters were scratched, not painted, carved into the frame's edge with something sharp. Suddenly, the air felt cold enough to make my breath visible. That was when I decided to move it to take it down until I could figure out what was wrong. But the moment I reached for it, my wrist brushed against the edge and I felt a small splinter of metal embedded in the wood. A nail, a pin, I don't know. I pulled my hand back, and for just a second I could have sworn the painted eyes followed the movement. I know how it sounds, a grieving widow projecting emotions onto an object. But here's what makes it strange. From that night on, anyone who came into the house, friends, neighbors, even the mailman, commented on how intense that painting was, as if it radiated something unspoken. My neighbor joked that he'd never seen art that made him feel guilty for no reason. By the end of the week, I stopped turning on the hallway light altogether. I didn't want to see him. Or rather, I didn't want to see what he saw in me. It's funny how love can outlive death, but also twist into something unrecognizable. The portrait wasn't just a painting anymore. It was a reminder that my husband might have left behind more than just a will. He left a presence, a silent question hanging between us, one I wasn't ready to answer. And that's where it all truly began, the night a simple painting became the loudest voice in my house. When the will was read, the portrait was hanging right behind the lawyer, as if my husband had arranged the whole thing for maximum irony. We gathered in the living room, me, my son, my daughter, and his daughter from his first marriage. The air smelled like burnt coffee and distrust. The lawyer, a polite man with thinning hair and the patience of a saint, unfolded the document with slow precision. It should have been a formality, but the minute he started, everyone leaned forward like predators. I swear even the portrait seemed to lean in. I'd been married long enough to know my husband's favorite trick, keeping secrets in plain sight. He loved creating puzzles out of ordinary things, birthday cards, crossword grids, even recipes. So when the lawyer began reading his words aloud, I braced myself. To my beloved wife, I leave our home and the art collection. That part went smoothly, though I could already feel my stepdaughter's glare burning a hole in my cardigan. To my children, I leave the remaining investments to be divided equally, except for the studio account, which will be managed according to a separate instruction. Separate instruction. Those two words landed like stones. The lawyer hesitated, glancing at the portrait over my shoulder as if asking permission to go on. This instruction, he said, was given verbally and recorded in a letter I received privately from your husband. The room went silent, except for the faint ticking of the hallway clock, his clock, of course. Family dynamics can collapse faster than any economy. 1 minute you're sharing casseroles and condolences, and the next you're eyeing each other like thieves. Psychologists call it inheritance friction. Apparently, 70% of families experience conflict over estates. The other 30% are probably lying. My son was the first to break the silence. "Mom, what's the studio account?" he asked. His tone polite, but with that sharpness, I recognized his father's legacy. "It's just a fund for maintenance." I lied. I didn't want to admit I didn't know either. The lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and added, "It contains a significant sum, but the instruction was that it not be distributed until a certain condition is met." I caught a faint reflection in the portrait's glass. My husband's eyes, dark and steady, seemed to glint with amusement. I used to love that expression. Now it looked smug. My stepdaughter, who had been quiet so far, snapped her nails against the table. "A condition? What kind of game is this?" she spat. She was always the loudest of the three, proud of her father's first family name like it was a badge. Her mother had been his great love, or so she liked to remind me. "It's ridiculous," she went on. "He should have made everything equal." That was the first time I noticed it. The painting's eyes seemed slightly off-center, angled toward her. I blinked, rubbed my temples, but when I looked again, it was clear he was staring at her. It wasn't possible, but the air around her seemed thicker charged. The lawyer wrapped up the reading with a formal tone, thanked us for our time, and promised to contact me about the remaining details. My son offered to drive him home, his attempt at civility, but as soon as the door shut, the house erupted. "You knew about this, didn't you?" my stepdaughter accused. "I didn't," I said calmly. "You always act innocent," she snapped. "Dad told me you were changing things behind his back." "That's not true." "Oh, please. You had him wrapped around your finger." My daughter tried to intervene, but I could see she didn't fully believe me either. Grief does that, it makes suspicion contagious. And in that storm of accusations, I couldn't stop looking at the portrait. It loomed like a silent judge, unmoving, yet everywhere. Later, when everyone left, I sat in the same spot where the lawyer had been and studied my husband's painted face. The brushstrokes were meticulous. His artist had captured his smirk, his stillness, the faint sag at the corner of his mouth. And then I saw it. In the background, barely visible, there was something faint grayish, blurred like a shape behind his chair. I moved closer. It looked like a letter, a painted envelope just resting there. It hit me then that my husband had orchestrated this. He had always believed art could outlive law, that a painting could speak truth long after paper decayed. He once said, "A will is for lawyers, but a portrait, that's for eternity." I had laughed at the time. Now it felt like a threat. I spent the rest of the night replaying every conversation we'd ever had about that portrait. He had insisted on meeting the artist alone. He'd called it his legacy piece. I thought it was vanity. Maybe it was more like confession. People still debate whether secrets are acts of love or cruelty. Personally, I think they're both, because every secret protects someone while destroying someone else. By morning, my eyes ached from staring at the thing. I wrapped it in an old bedsheet and moved it to the guest room facing the wall. When my daughter stopped by later that day, she asked, "Mom, where's the portrait?" "I put it away," I said. "Good," she sighed. It felt wrong, like he was still here. That night, I dreamed of him. He wasn't young, not the way I like to remember him, but exactly as he appeared in that portrait, gray temples, tired eyes, quiet mouth. He didn't speak, but behind him, I saw a stack of letters. He motioned toward them, then at me, then vanished. I woke up to find the house freezing cold, every window fogged over. There's an old superstition about mirrors and paintings, after someone dies, that they capture part of the soul if left uncovered. My grandmother used to cover all the portraits in black cloth after funerals, saying the dead might still be looking for a way back. I laughed at those traditions then, but as I stood there watching the faint outline of the painting through the bedsheet, I began to wonder if she was right. A week passed. The tension among the children grew. My son stopped answering my calls. My daughter kept hinting that I should resolve things peacefully, and my stepdaughter posted cryptic quotes about betrayal on social media. Family love in the age of Wi-Fi, it's a battlefield of subtweets and passive-aggressive emojis. Then on the 8th night, the lawyer called again. His tone was unusually cautious. "There's something your husband mentioned that wasn't in the official will," he said. "A personal note. He said you'd find it eventually, but..." He left a hint. I felt my throat tighten. "What kind of hint?" "It's in the portrait," he said quietly. He told me when she looks closely enough, she'll see what I never said. And just like that, I knew the story wasn't over. The painting wasn't just decoration or legacy. It was an unfinished conversation, one that would make sure none of us could move on until it was complete. The next evening, I found myself eating dinner alone, though I barely touched the food. My fork clinked against the plate in slow, distracted rhythm, like a metronome for my thoughts. The painting was still in the guest room covered, but somehow its presence stretched through the walls. It's odd how silence can travel. It fills every corner you try to ignore. I thought about calling my son, but he'd made himself scarce since the will reading. My daughter sent a text earlier that just said, "Mom, don't get too obsessed." She knew me too well. When I latch onto something, I dig until I hit the bone. I got up, rinsed the dishes, and stood in front of the guest room door. The air behind it felt heavier, as if the temperature dropped a few degrees. I told myself I'd just peek at it, maybe laugh at how silly I'd been. But the moment I lifted the sheet, every nerve in my body tightened. The painting looked different. Not drastically, but enough to make me freeze. The background seemed darker, the shadows around his shoulders deeper, and this one scared me. The angle of his eyes looked slightly shifted. Instead of gazing straight ahead, he appeared to be looking just over my shoulder toward the dining room. I turned around fast. Nothing. Just the ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I exhaled slowly and whispered, "Stop it. He's gone." Still, I moved the painting back into the living room, where the light was brighter. I needed to prove to myself that it wasn't changing, that my mind was the real culprit. I sat across from it with a cup of chamomile tea and forced myself to look. If you've ever stared at a single image long enough, you know it begins to move, almost breathe. The brain gets restless. It starts filling in what isn't been. But this was different. I saw something flicker in those eyes. Recognition. I laughed nervously and said, "You always had that glare, you know." It was half a joke, half a plea for comfort. But saying it out loud made me think about that last week before he died. He'd been quieter than usual, sketching alone in his studio. I remember asking him once what he was working on, and he said perspective. I thought he meant geometry. Now I realize he meant legacy. Around 8, the doorbell rang. It was my stepdaughter. She came in without waiting for me to invite her perfume loud enough to make the house smell like confrontation. "We need to talk," she said, setting her purse down like a declaration of war. "About Dad's will." I sighed. "I thought we already did that." "Not properly," she said. Her tone was brittle, rehearsed. "You're hiding something." "I'm not." She walked past me and stopped right in front of the painting. "Why is this thing out again?" "Because it's his," I said simply. She studied it with narrowed eyes. "Creepy. I swear he's watching us." Then something happened that neither of us could explain. The chandelier light flickered just once, and in that brief stutter of brightness, the portrait's expression seemed to change. I'm not exaggerating. His mouth, painted in that calm, closed line, looked like it curled ever so slightly into a smirk. My stepdaughter gasped, stepping back. "You saw that, right?" she whispered. I didn't answer. I was too stunned. Instead, I said something absurd. "Maybe he disapproves of your attitude." She glared at me. "That's not funny." But it was funny, darkly so. I smiled for the first time in days, though it felt wrong. She stormed out a few minutes later, muttering something about getting legal advice. I didn't stop her. The moment she left, I poured myself another cup of tea that quickly turned into wine. I stared at the painting again, almost daring it to move. "You always loved your little games," I said, under my breath. "Fine. Let's play." As I sat there, I remembered something strange about the night before the will reading. I'd gone into his study looking for a pen and noticed an envelope sticking out of one of his art books. The title was Hidden Messages in Renaissance Portraiture. It seemed fitting for him. He'd always been fascinated by symbols and codes in old art. But the envelope was empty. At the time, I assumed he'd reused it for notes. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe that was his way of telling me where to look. People still debate whether our loved ones find ways to communicate after death. Some say dreams, others say coincidences. I don't know which I believe, but that night, I felt like I was standing in the middle of one. I decided to inspect the portrait closely. I took a magnifying glass from the drawer, the kind he used to read fine print, and scanned every inch. At first, nothing, just the artist's brushwork, soft and deliberate. Then, in the lower right corner, where his initials were carved, I noticed something tiny like a faint indentation on the paint's surface. I tilted the frame toward the light. The shape looked almost like a keyhole, not literal, but symbolic. A small oval painted so subtly that without focus you'd never notice it. I pressed my fingertip over it. The paint was rough there, textured differently. My heart started racing. I lifted the frame off the wall and turned it over. The back was solid wood, sealed, but I remembered that little metallic splinter I'd felt earlier. I ran my hand along the edge again, and this time I found a loose nail. I pried it slightly and heard a soft click. The corner shifted just enough to reveal a folded slip of paper wedged between the canvas and the frame. My pulse hammered. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was his angular, deliberate. It said only 6 words. "The truth is behind your guilt." I read it 3 times, my throat dry. What truth? What guilt? Was he accusing me of something or warning me about someone else? My mind ran through possibilities like a slot machine. Maybe it was about the studio account, or maybe... No, I couldn't even think it. Then something else dawned on me. Behind your guilt. It wasn't metaphorical, it might be literal. Behind me. The portrait was hanging opposite the hallway mirror. When I turned toward it, I saw my own reflection split in two, the real me and the version the painting watched. For a second, I felt dizzy, as if both images were arguing silently about who I really was. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his painted face, those words that smirk. Around 3 a.m., I got up and wandered into the kitchen. The clock read 3:17, his birth date reversed. I laughed nervously at the coincidence. Then from the hallway, I heard a faint creak, like a door hinge or wood expanding, but all the doors were shut. When I peeked around the corner, the painting seemed lighter again, brighter, as if the eyes had softened. I whispered, "What are you trying to tell me?" But of course no answer came. The next morning, sunlight hit the canvas perfectly, and I finally noticed something else hidden in plain sight. The envelope painted in the background, it wasn't random. On its surface were faint letters, "To be continued," and in that moment I realized my husband's will wasn't the end of anything. It was just the beginning of a story he'd decided to keep telling long after he was gone. The next few days unfolded like a foggy dream where every sound felt louder than it should and every silence felt charged. I couldn't stop thinking about that note. Those 6 words burned into my mind like a confession I hadn't made yet. The truth is behind your guilt. It played in loops like an old vinyl, skipping at the same line over and over. My children still called occasionally, mostly to argue or to check in, which was code for seeing if I'd done anything suspicious with the inheritance. They didn't know that the most valuable thing in the house wasn't the will or the money. It was the portrait, or maybe the secret inside it. One evening, as I watered the plants near the window, I caught a reflection in the glass. The portrait's eyes weren't fixed on me anymore. They were angled toward the staircase. For a moment I froze, watering can still in my hand. The light shifted again and the gaze returned to normal. I blinked, muttering, "I'm losing it." But deep down, I wasn't sure I was. The portrait had already proven it could change depending on who was in the room. My stepdaughter saw anger. My son saw disappointment. I saw judgment. Maybe it was painting us all differently, piece by piece. That night, my daughter came over for dinner. She was trying to keep peace, but I could see the exhaustion in her face. "Mom," she said as she sat down, "you need to stop obsessing over that portrait. Dad's gone. Let it go." "I'm not obsessing," I lied. "I'm analyzing." She laughed dryly. "You sound like him." Her words hit me harder than I expected, because she was right. I did sound like him, methodical, curious, controlling. I had spent years accusing him of hiding things, of manipulating emotions through silence. And now, here I was, talking to a painting like it was an oracle. The irony wasn't lost on me. We ate mostly in silence. At one point, her fork clattered against the plate and she flinched. "Sorry," she said. This house gives me chills now." She gestured toward the portrait. "You should move it to the attic or something. It's not healthy." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. Instead, I said quietly, "You think guilt can change the way we see someone?" She frowned. "What do you mean? I mean, maybe what we see in someone's face isn't who they were, but what they left unfinished in us." She looked at me like I'd started speaking another language. "Mom, you need to sleep." She left soon after, and I was alone again. I turned off the lights, leaving only the small lamp beside the portrait. The shadows in the room stretched long and restless. I found myself whispering, "If the truth is behind my guilt, what truth?" And that's when I remembered the studio, the place he'd spent his final weeks where he painted, wrote, and kept his strange little rituals. My husband had always believed in symbols. He'd once said that every lie leaves fingerprints in the air. I thought it was just poetic nonsense. Now I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I drove to the old studio. It was a small brick building behind our garden, dusty and forgotten. The key was still on my ring, though it took me 3 tries to fit it right. When the door creaked open, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil hit me like a memory. His easel stood exactly where he'd left it, the stool still stained with paint. But the canvas on it wasn't the portrait, it was something else, something unfinished. It looked like a landscape at first, gray hills, a horizon, and in the center, a tiny figure facing away. I stepped closer and felt a chill run down my spine. The figure was wearing my favorite shawl, the one I'd worn on our anniversary. My breath caught. The details were unmistakable. My posture, my hair bun, even the way I crossed my arms when thinking. He had been painting me, but from behind, as if I were walking away from him forever. I ran my fingers lightly over the dried paint, tracing the outline. In the lower left corner, barely visible, were his initials again. Beneath them, a faint word, forgiveness. I sank into the stool, my knees weak. So this was his perspective, his way of watching me leave even when I stayed. We had fought that year terribly. He accused me of emotional distance. I accused him of secrets. Maybe we were both right. People still debate whether marriages die from what's said or from what's left unsaid. In our case, it was the latter. As I sat there, I noticed a small wooden box tucked under the table. Inside were several sketches, faces, hands, abstract shapes, but one stood out, a pencil sketch of the same portrait that now hung in my living room. Except in this version, there was a second figure, me standing behind his chair, one hand resting on his shoulder. My face was unfinished, the pencil lines faint, almost erased. It hit me like a wave. The painting wasn't about him at all. It was about us, our unfinished story, our half-spoken apologies. The message, "The truth is behind your guilt," wasn't accusation, it was direction. He was asking me to face what I hadn't faced in life, that I'd given up on us long before death did. I don't know how long I stayed there staring at the sketches, but when I finally returned home, the house felt different, calmer, almost forgiving. The portrait still hung where I left it, yet for the first time, the expression on his face seemed softer. Later that evening, the phone rang. It was the lawyer again. I found something he said, a sealed letter in the studio's safe. "It's addressed to you." My pulse quickened. "What does it say? I haven't opened it," he replied. "But the cover says, to be read only after she sees." "After I see what?" He hesitated. "I think you already know." After I hung up, I turned to the portrait again. I looked into those painted eyes that had tormented me for weeks, and for the first time I spoke without fear. "I saw it," I said quietly. "I understand now." For a moment I could swear his eyes looked lighter, almost peaceful. The light in the room shifted as if something invisible had finally exhaled. And though I couldn't prove it, I felt it, the sense that forgiveness, real forgiveness, had finally entered the room. That night, I dreamed of the two of us sitting together in the studio. He was painting and I was laughing at something trivial. There was no tension, no guilt, just color and quiet understanding. When I woke up, I realized the portrait wasn't judging me anymore. It was listening. The morning after the dream, I woke up before sunrise. The house was drenched in that pale blue light that makes everything look softer, almost forgiven. I made coffee and sat in front of the portrait again as if it were a daily ritual, now a conversation between the living and the painted. I don't know if it's madness or healing, but both can feel the same when you're alone. For a moment, I thought about removing it again, locking it in the attic like my daughter suggested, but the thought made my stomach turn. The portrait wasn't haunting me anymore. It was holding me accountable. Around 9 a.m., there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, the family lawyer stood there holding a large envelope and a cautious smile. "Good morning," he said. "I think this belongs to you." We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight pooling between us like an audience. He placed the envelope down gently. "Your husband left this sealed letter in the studio safe. He instructed that it only be delivered once you had seen what he wanted you to see." I traced the edge of the paper, afraid to open it. "Did you read it?" "No," he said, but he told me it wasn't about assets. It was about closure. That word closure felt too clean for what I was living. Still, I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter, his familiar script steady and deliberate. "My love, it began. If you're reading this, then you've already faced the painting. You've seen what I couldn't tell you in life." I stopped breathing. My hands shook as I kept reading. I knew you hated how quiet I became toward the end, but silence was the only way I could finish what we started. I painted that portrait with the artist because I wanted to leave behind not an image, but a confession. Every stroke holds something unsaid. The letter you found hidden behind the frame was meant to guide you toward the truth, not mine but yours. You've carried guilt that wasn't yours to bear. I know you think you stopped loving me. You didn't. You just forgot how to show it. I had to set the paper down. Tears burned at the edge of my eyes, but I wasn't sure if they were from pain or release. I took a deep breath and continued. I knew about your loneliness. I saw it in the way you avoided mirrors, the way you stayed busy to avoid thinking. I knew about the letters you never sent to your sister, the one you argued with years ago. I knew you still blamed yourself for your mother's death. You always thought guilt defined you, but I wanted you to see that guilt is only a shadow. Without light, it cannot exist. The truth is behind your guilt, because forgiveness always stands behind it. You just had to look long enough. The words blurred as I read them. I pressed the page to my chest, my heartbeat thundering beneath it. For years, I had blamed myself for everything, for his illness, for our distance, for not saying I love you enough. But in that moment, something shifted. Maybe he wasn't accusing me at all. Maybe he was setting me free. At the bottom of the page, one final line stood out. If you ever feel lost again, look closely at the portrait. There's one last thing you haven't seen. The lawyer cleared his throat softly. Do you want me to stay? He asked. No, I whispered. This part's mine. After he left, I went straight to the portrait. The morning light caught the canvas at a perfect angle, revealing textures I hadn't noticed before. The longer I looked, the clearer something became barely visible, brushstrokes forming faint letters in the shadow beneath his armchair. I leaned closer. It wasn't random. It was a date, 11/19/17. My breath caught. That was the date of our biggest fight, the day I'd almost left him. I remember it vividly. It was raining. He'd accused me of caring more about our image than our marriage. I told him he only cared about being right. We didn't speak for 2 days after that, but on the third day, he brought me coffee in bed. Quietly placed his hand over mine and said, "Some things don't need fixing, just patience." That was the day he started painting in secret. I thought he was painting landscapes. I never realized he was painting us. The date beneath his armchair wasn't an accusation, it was a timestamp of reconciliation. He wanted me to remember that love can survive even the ugliest silences. I sat down across from the portrait, tears finally spilling over, and whispered, "You win." You always did. That evening, I called my daughter and asked her to come over. When she arrived, she found me smiling for the first time in weeks. "Mom, what happened?" she asked. "I found his letter," I said softly. He wasn't angry. He was forgiving me. She blinked, unsure whether to believe me. "Forgiving you for what?" "For being human," I said simply. "For not knowing how to love him perfectly." We sat together in front of the painting. She studied it silently for a while and then said, "You know, his eyes look warmer now." I smiled faintly. They do. Family experts say grief evolves in stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But no one talks about the stage that comes after acceptance, understanding. That's the quiet moment when you stop asking why and start whispering, "Thank you." Later that night, after my daughter left, I poured myself a small glass of wine and turned on the fan, just like I told you to. The sound mixed with the hum of the night, creating a calm rhythm that matched my breathing. I sat facing the portrait, just me and him again. "You know," I said aloud, "people still debate whether the dead can hear us." I paused, smiling through the tears. "But I think you can, because this time I can feel you listening." And then maybe it was the trick of the light, or maybe not, the portrait seemed to soften again. The eyes weren't watching anymore. They were simply present. The faintest smile touched his lips, not of judgment, but of peace. I stayed there until the clock struck midnight, the kind of silence that no longer hurt, but healed, wrapping around me. The portrait didn't just speak louder than his will. It said what his will never could, that love in its quietest form is still the loudest voice of all. The days that followed were strange in their tranquility. For the first time in weeks, the house felt like it belonged to the living, not haunted by the echoes of the past. I started moving through rooms without the heavy weight of accusation pressing on my chest. Even the portrait seemed different. Its presence was no longer menacing but gentle like a quiet companion. I kept expecting some dramatic revelation to explode, but instead there was only calm, the kind that sinks deep into your bones and makes your skin feel warmer than it has in months. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. The letter had given me understanding, but there was something left unspoken. My husband had left layers behind a labyrinth of hidden messages that extended beyond the canvas. He had always loved puzzles, crossword games, secret compartments, playful riddles, but this was different. The message in the painting wasn't just a joke, it was a lesson, a reminder, a way to confront the unfinished pieces of ourselves. I found myself wandering to his old studio again, compelled by a mixture of reverence and anticipation. The door creaked the same familiar way, and the smell of linseed oil and turpentine welcomed me, like a memory I hadn't wanted to let go of. I approached the easel, running my fingers along the canvas edges. The unfinished sketch from before still rested there, but this time I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tiny notes scribbled along the margins, almost invisible to the eye. Words like truth, patience, guilt, and love were scattered in careful pencil strokes. I realized that my husband had been documenting more than our faces. He had been chronicling our emotions, our missteps, and our reconciliation. The sketches weren't just art. They were therapy sessions captured in graphite and oil, a silent archive of intimacy. I laughed softly, shaking my head. People still debate whether art is for the artist or the observer. In this case, it seemed like it was both a way for him to communicate across time, a bridge from the living to the dead. As I delved further, I discovered a small notebook tucked behind the canvases. Its cover was worn, the pages yellowed. I flipped it open and realized it was his journal. My husband had meticulously noted small moments, our late-night talks, the way I tended the garden, the afternoons I spent reading to our children. But then I came across an entry that made me pause. It was dated the week before his passing, and it read, "If she finds the portrait, she will see more than just my face. She will see herself. I hope she can forgive herself before she judges anyone else." The words hit me like a revelation. This was why the painting had felt so accusatory at first, because it reflected my own guilt. Every flicker of disapproval, every shadow in his painted eyes was a mirror of my own insecurities. I had been so consumed with fear that I misread his silent communication as judgment. But the truth was far more generous. He wanted me to see myself clearly, to reconcile with the parts of me I had neglected to confront the shadows I carried. I spent hours in the studio moving sketches and paintings around, piecing together the hidden narrative. Each brushstroke, each marginal note felt like a conversation with him. It was eerie, but comforting. By the time I left, the sun had set, casting a warm glow over the backyard. I realized I had begun seeing our home differently, not as a battleground of inheritance and resentment, but as a vessel of memory and love. That evening, I invited my daughter over. I wanted to share what I had discovered to bridge the distance that had grown between us over the last few weeks. She arrived cautiously aware that something significant had shifted. I led her to the portrait, letting her take in the eyes she had once described as intense. "It's different," she said quietly, studying it. "Warmer." "I know," I replied. "It's always been this way. I just didn't know how to see it." I told her about the sketches, the journal, the hidden notes. Her eyes widened, and for a moment the tension that had lingered between us melted. We sat together in silence, listening to the soft hum of the night. Family psychologists say that reconciliation doesn't require grand gestures. Sometimes it's quiet understanding, a shared acknowledgement of past mistakes, and a willingness to forgive. That night, we achieved exactly that. Later, I walked through the house alone, noting how each room felt different. The living room, once suffocating with unspoken grievances, now held a quiet dignity. The dining room, where arguments had once erupted, felt like a space for calm conversations. Even the kitchen, with its faint scent of chamomile and morning light, seemed to whisper that life could be simple and soft. I returned to the portrait, my hands brushing the frame lightly. "You've done your work," I whispered, as if he could hear me. "Now I can do mine." And for the first time since his passing, I felt a profound sense of release, not from grief, but from understanding. The portrait had guided me through the labyrinth of guilt, fear, and miscommunication, and now it rested silently, a guardian of our shared past. It's strange how objects carry memory. A simple painting, a small sketch, a handwritten note, they can hold decades of emotion, witness to the unspoken, and reminders of what truly matters. I realized that my husband's legacy wasn't wealth, nor even the house we shared. It was the quiet insistence to confront truth, to face our own flaws, and to forgive. People still debate whether legacy is measured in possessions or lessons. I now know it is the lessons etched in paint paper and love. That night, I placed the letter and notebook on the side table beside the portrait, a small shrine of understanding. The house was quiet, yet full resonant with the echoes of a man who had found a way to speak beyond death. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I slept with a soft, steady heartbeat, my breath, even the weight of guilt, lifted from my chest. A few days later, the calm was broken not by anger or accusation, but by curiosity. I couldn't stop thinking about the second draft of the will that the lawyer had hinted at, the one no one had officially seen. My husband had always been meticulous, a man who never left loose ends, so I trusted that whatever he wrote had purpose. I couldn't help wondering if there was more truth hidden there, another layer meant only for me. I called the lawyer and asked him to bring the documents over. He arrived with his usual careful demeanor, briefcase in hand, as if carrying the weight of years of secrecy. "I think you're ready," he said. "This will is the one your husband revised at the very end. It wasn't filed officially, but he made sure I had it. Only you were meant to see it." I took the papers with trembling fingers. Each page was neat, precise, his handwriting exacting. The differences between the first will and this draft were subtle but powerful. He had shifted a few allocations, removed some names from certain accounts, and added a short paragraph that had me sitting back in shock. It wasn't about money at all, it was about recognition. He had written, "To the woman who walked beside me through life's storms, I leave not possessions, but understanding. To those who misunderstood, I leave patience. To those I never properly acknowledged, I leave memory. And to the one who will come after me, if fate allows, I leave love in its truest form." I read the paragraph again and again. The one who will come after me struck me like a thunderbolt. Could it be a child? A relative? Someone unknown. My pulse quickened. My husband had lived quietly with his secret for decades, and now I was holding it in my hands. People still debate whether legacy is in blood or in lessons. I realized that in his case, it was both. That night, I sat before the portrait, the second draft of the will spread across my lap. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses gently against your chest but doesn't suffocate. I looked at the painting, his eyes calmer now than ever seemed to encourage me, as if urging me to uncover the truth without fear. I began to imagine what he had meant by the one who will come after me. Was it metaphorical, a symbolic gesture about continuation and influence, or was it literal? The idea filled me with a curious mix of fear and anticipation. I couldn't sleep, and so I returned to the studio, drawn again to the sketches and the journal. There, amidst the familiar smell of paint and old wood, I felt closer to him than I had in months. In the dim light, I began to examine the sketches more closely. There was a series I hadn't noticed before, small portraits, lightly sketched, each one capturing a childlike face. One of them had a strong resemblance to someone I couldn't place immediately. The eyes the same intensity as the portrait on my wall. My mind raced. Could this be the child my husband had mentioned, the one referenced in the will? I carefully documented everything, taking photographs and notes. Each sketch seemed to whisper a story, faint but undeniable. My husband had been meticulous in capturing traits, expressions, gestures, almost as if preparing a silent introduction to the family who might not yet know. By the next morning, I had gathered courage enough to call the lawyer. "I think there's someone we need to locate," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "A person mentioned in the will, the one who comes after him." The lawyer's face changed subtly. "I suspected you'd say that," he said. "I've heard rumors, but nothing concrete. Your husband never spoke of this publicly. We spent hours reviewing records, sketches, and documents. The lawyer cross-referenced dates, birth records, and even old correspondences. It was painstaking work, like piecing together a puzzle whose edges were deliberately hidden. Finally, we found a lead, a young adult, someone in their mid-20s whose features matched the sketches and the subtle hints in my husband's journal. I was stunned. A child I had never known existed quietly, part of the family's hidden legacy. My emotions were a whirlwind shock, curiosity, a touch of fear, and something else, a deep, resonant empathy. My husband had prepared this introduction carefully, leaving just enough breadcrumbs for me to find the truth. The day I arranged to meet this young person, the house felt tense again. I moved the portrait to the living room, placing it in full view. The painting had guided me through grief, guilt, and revelation, and now it would witness the next chapter of our story. I wanted the portrait's presence to be steady, reassuring. When they arrived, I was struck by the uncanny resemblance, the same eyes, the same slight curl of the lips, the familiar tilt of the head. I realized then that the portrait had not been a warning, not a judgment, but a bridge. It connected the past, present, and future. The child my husband never publicly acknowledged was here, and in a strange, almost mystical way, the portrait had prepared me for this moment. We talked for hours, slowly unraveling the threads of a life that had remained hidden. Their understanding, their questions, their laughter, it was all part of a reunion my husband had orchestrated silently. People still debate whether revelations like this bring joy or turmoil. In our case, it was both. By the end of the visit, I felt a profound sense of resolution. The portrait, watching quietly from across the room, seemed to glow, not literally, of course, but in the way it occupied space, holding the weight of our shared history. I understood then that the painting was never just about him. It was about us all, past, present, and those yet to come. As evening fell, I sat before it once more, reflecting on everything, the hidden notes, the sketches, the second draft of the will, and now the presence of this new family member. My husband had orchestrated a masterful lesson in patience, empathy, and love. The house was alive with memory, with revelation, and with quiet forgiveness. For the first time since his death, I felt whole. The portrait had spoken not with words, but with presence. It had guided me through guilt, grief, curiosity, and finally, understanding. I realized that the true inheritance was not money, not assets, not even the house. It was the clarity, the lessons, and the connection that endured beyond death. That night, I left the portrait where it belonged, knowing it would continue to watch silently, patiently. It had fulfilled its purpose, and in turn, I had found a path through the labyrinth of my own emotions. The following week, the house felt different in subtle ways. Even the air seemed lighter, infused with a quiet sense of anticipation, rather than tension. The portrait hung in the living room, steady and calm, yet there was something about the light that shifted during the day. Sunlight spilling across the canvas in the morning gave the painted eyes a warmth I had never noticed before. Shadows lengthened in the afternoon, creating a soft halo around his head that almost looked like forgiveness made visible. I had come to realize that the painting wasn't just observing, it was participating in its own silent, patient way in the unfolding story. One evening after dinner, I was sitting with a cup of tea, the second draft of the will, and the sketches spread out on the table before me. The young adult my husband had acknowledged had returned home briefly, visiting their mother and other relatives, but I remained in the house alone with the portrait. I studied it again, searching for some detail I might have missed, some whisper of truth hidden in brushstrokes. It was then that I noticed a small crack along the bottom of the glass covering the canvas. At first, I assumed it had been there for weeks, unnoticed. But when I leaned closer, I realized the crack had formed recently, thin and jagged like a frozen lightning bolt. I pressed my fingertip near it and felt a faint vibration as if the frame itself were responding to my touch. I stepped back, my heart quickening. The portrait had been static, yet now in this quiet moment it seemed almost alive. I recalled the superstition my grandmother had once whispered to me after a death mirrors and paintings could hold pieces of the soul. I had dismissed it for years, laughed even, but now staring at the fractured glass, I wondered if there was truth to the old tales. The crack was not violent. It didn't shatter or threaten to fall. It seemed intentional, a subtle clue left for me to notice. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this some kind of message, a symbolic fracture representing the breaking of old misunderstandings, or was it merely coincidence? People still debate whether objects can bear consciousness beyond their material nature. I wasn't sure which side I fell on, but I could feel the weight of the question pressing against me. The next day, I returned to the studio. The sketches and the journal had been left meticulously arranged, almost as if my husband anticipated that I would return. I examined the sketches once more and noticed something I hadn't seen before, a series of lines beneath the unfinished figures that resembled coordinates. My pulse quickened. Coordinates. That seemed absurd, yet the precision of his handwriting and the placement of the lines suggested deliberation. I cross-referenced them with the studio's location and other landmarks from our home. They led to a secluded spot in the back garden, an area we rarely used. A feeling of both excitement and trepidation rose in my chest. My husband had always been fond of hidden compartments and secret messages. Could this be another layer, another puzzle intended to guide me further? I spent the afternoon exploring the garden, following the faint marks suggested by the sketches. At first, I found nothing, just the familiar soil, the old roses, and the wooden bench my husband had carved with his initials decades earlier. Then behind a cluster of hedges, I spotted a small metal box partially buried under leaves. I knelt, brushing away the soil, and realized it was locked. The craftsmanship was precise, almost ornate, and there was a small keyhole that seemed familiar. I recalled the small key embedded in the portrait frame, the one I had found weeks ago. Could it fit here? My hands trembled as I retrieved the tiny key and inserted it into the lock. The mechanism clicked softly and the box opened. Inside, I found a collection of letters tied with a ribbon and a folded photograph I didn't recognize immediately. The letters were addressed to me, written in my husband's unmistakable hand. Each one recounted moments from our marriage reflections on mistakes, expressions of love and guidance for the future. The tone was gentle yet firm, always nudging me toward understanding, patience, and forgiveness. One letter stood out with a simple line at the end. "This is the last secret I leave. Share it when you're ready to understand fully." I unfolded the photograph carefully. It depicted a young boy standing next to my husband, both smiling at something off camera. The resemblance to the portrait was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same subtle curl of the mouth. I understood then that this was the child referenced in the second draft of the will. My husband had taken steps to ensure that even those unknown to me were introduced into our family story, safely, subtly, and thoughtfully. I sat there on the ground, the letters in my lap, the photograph in my hands, and the wind rustling the leaves around me. A profound realization swept over me. My husband had orchestrated not only a legacy of objects and money, but a legacy of understanding love and connection that transcended death. He had used the portrait, the sketches, the journal, and now this hidden cache to guide me, to teach me, and to reveal the truths I had been too afraid to face. By evening, I returned to the house. The portrait hung calmly, as if aware of my discovery. I spoke aloud, softly, as if confessing to him directly. "I understand now. I see what you meant. You weren't judging me. You were guiding me." The room felt warmer, lighter, imbued with a quiet reverence. I knew that the portrait had completed its purpose. Its silent observation had been a lesson in perception, patience, and empathy. That night, I placed the letters and photograph on the side table beside the portrait, creating a small shrine to memory, love, and truth. The house no longer felt heavy with the weight of inheritance or unresolved guilt. Instead, it felt alive with history, wisdom, and connection. Even the crack in the glass seemed symbolic now, not a flaw, but an emblem of vulnerability and growth. As I drifted to sleep, I reflected on the remarkable ways my husband had communicated beyond the limitations of life. Through paint paper and hidden messages, he had left me a map for understanding, for reconciliation, and for continued love. The portrait had spoken not with words, but with presence. It had guided me through guilt, grief, curiosity, and finally clarity. I realized then that his legacy was not just the tangible money, possessions, property, but the intangible, the lessons he left embedded in every brushstroke, every carefully hidden note, and every quiet moment that led me to face myself fully. He had created a story in which I was both observer and participant teacher and student witness and reconciler. For the first time since his death, I felt a deep, enduring peace. The portrait no longer demanded my attention with intensity. It watched, yes, but it also listened. And I knew, finally, that the love, guidance, and understanding he had woven into every hidden corner of our lives would continue to resonate long after I, too, had passed. Weeks passed, and life began to settle into a rhythm I hadn't felt in months. The portrait remained in the living room, but its presence was no longer tense. It had become a quiet companion, a witness to our ongoing family interactions rather than a source of dread. My son returned more frequently, cautiously at first, then with more ease, asking questions about the letters, the sketches, and the child my husband had acknowledged in the second will. It was as if the portrait had mediated the conversations, softening the edges of long-held resentment and creating a space for dialogue. The young adult my husband had introduced into our lives became a bridge between generations. Conversations flowed more naturally than I could have imagined. We shared stories, compared memories, and for the first time laughed together without the shadow of guilt or suspicion hovering above us. The house once heavy with silence was now filled with life. The low hum of conversation, the clinking of teacups, and the occasional burst of laughter that echoed through the hallways. One afternoon, I returned to the studio for what I thought would be a routine check. I didn't expect to find anything new yet. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed a faint envelope tucked beneath the easel, almost invisible beneath the dust and shadows. Carefully, I pulled it out. My husband's handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, and deliberate. The note was short. "If you are seeing this, know that the final piece of our story is revealed. You have completed what I began. Share it wisely." I understood instantly what he meant. The final piece of the story wasn't just about the child, the will, or the hidden sketches. It was about connection, reconciliation, and understanding the truths that required no money, no documents, no legal validation. He had built an intricate path for me to follow, a journey that led to forgiveness, clarity, and the integration of past mistakes into a cohesive narrative. That evening, I invited my children and the newly acknowledged young adult to sit with me in the living room. The portrait hung behind me, silent but present, observing the unfolding scene with an almost comforting gaze. We shared stories of my husband, recalling both the frustrations and the moments of tenderness. The laughter was genuine, the conversation flowing, and for the first time, the room felt complete, not just a house, but a home. During a quiet pause, I looked up at the portrait. The eyes, once so intense and demanding, now seemed soft, almost approving. I whispered to myself, "You've done your work, I've done mine, and now it's time for everyone to continue forward." There was no supernatural sense, no magic, just a feeling of peace, the kind that comes after understanding, after truth has been confronted, and after love has been acknowledged. I spent the following days organizing the letters and sketches. Each one was cataloged, preserved, and arranged in a manner that told the story of our family, our past, and the careful orchestration my husband had left behind. The house became not only a place to live, but a repository of memory, a sanctuary of wisdom and quiet lessons. People still debate whether objects can hold intent, whether art can guide beyond the temporal boundaries of life. I knew through my experience that it could. The portrait, the hidden notes, the careful drafts, they had all directed me toward understanding and connection. One evening, while preparing dinner, my daughter walked past the living room and paused. She studied the portrait for a long moment. "Mom," she said softly, "I think I understand him now. Not just the man he was, but what he wanted us to see." "Yes," I replied, my voice gentle. That was always the point. To see, to understand, and to forgive ourselves along the way. The young adult nodded in agreement. "I never knew him," they said, "but I can feel the love and thoughtfulness he put into all of this. It's remarkable." It struck me then that legacy isn't just about the tangible. It isn't only in money, property, or documents. It's in the lessons we leave behind, in the paths we lay for others to follow, in the stories woven through objects, letters, and art. My husband had mastered this in a way that was both subtle and profound. He had guided us through grief, guilt, and misunderstanding, and by doing so had prepared us for a future we could navigate with clarity and empathy. That night, I sat alone before the portrait, reflecting on the journey. The house was quiet, the fan spinning gently, creating a soft, rhythmic hum. I whispered, "Thank you. Not for the will, not for the assets, not for the property, but for the guidance, for the lessons, for the careful orchestration of truth and love that had allowed me to reconcile with the past and embrace the present." The eyes in the painting seemed to soften further, though I knew it was my perception, shaped by understanding and acceptance. The cracks in the glass, once a source of unease, now seemed symbolic emblems of vulnerability, growth, and the acceptance of imperfection. The journey my husband had set in motion had come to a close, but its influence would resonate far into the future within me, and within the family he had so thoughtfully shaped. In that quiet moment, I realized the truth: love transcends the confines of life and death, of mistakes and misunderstandings. It is expressed not only through words, but through actions, through art, through deliberate care that guides even after one is gone. The portrait, the hidden letters, the drafts of the wills, all of it was a masterful orchestration of patience, wisdom, and enduring love. And so I sat with the painting, the letters and the photographs absorbing the depth of what had been left for me. The house was no longer a repository of secrets, but a sanctuary of understanding, where the past and present coexisted in harmony and where love, carefully constructed and thoughtfully conveyed, continued to speak louder than any words or documents ever could. It was a rainy evening when everything finally crystallized for me. The house smelled faintly of damp wood and chamomile tea I had brewed earlier, and the soft hum of the fan mixed with the patter of raindrops on the window. I was alone again, but in a way that didn't feel lonely. There was the portrait quietly observing the letters neatly stacked beside it, and the journal open to a page I had read dozens of times, but somehow never fully absorbed. For the first time, I felt ready to confront the entirety of what my husband had left behind, to close the circle he had so carefully designed. I began by reading the letters one more time, slowly savoring each word. He had written about moments of regret, small gestures of kindness, and unsaid apologies. Each letter was layered with insight, encouraging reflection and understanding, pushing me to see beyond my own guilt. One line struck me particularly: "The past is not a cage, it is a map. Follow it wisely, and you will find freedom." I realized then that the entire journey, the portrait, the hidden notes, the drafts of the will, had been that map, guiding me to freedom from guilt and resentment. The young adult my husband had introduced had returned for another visit, and the atmosphere felt warm and reconciliatory. We shared tea and stories, laughing softly over small anecdotes from family history. Even my children seemed lighter in their interactions, less burdened by suspicion, and more inclined to listen. It was as if the portrait, which had once been a silent sentinel, had completed its role as mediator. Its presence encouraged reflection, truth, and understanding. That night, I approached the portrait with a sense of solemnity. I spoke softly, almost whispering, as if the act itself could honor him. "I understand now. Not only the choices you made, but the way you wanted me to grow through them. You've given me clarity, love, and wisdom. I am grateful." The room was quiet, except for the gentle hum of the fan, yet I felt a profound connection, as if he were listening, absorbing my words, with that same quiet patience I had known in life. I noticed the small crack along the bottom of the glass, the one that had first unsettled me. Now it seemed like an emblem of growth, a symbol of the fragility of life and the resilience of love. What had once been a source of tension was now a reminder of the care, precision, and intentionality embedded in every detail my husband left behind. The painting, the letters, the drafts, all of it was a testament to the thoughtfulness of his legacy. As the night deepened, I placed the letters and photograph carefully beside the portrait, creating a small shrine to memory, reflection, and enduring love. I realized that his legacy was not measured in assets or property, but in the subtle guidance he had embedded in art text and the spaces between. The portrait had spoken louder than any will, conveying understanding, reconciliation, and the power of seeing beyond immediate appearances. I reflected on how strange, intricate, and beautiful human connection could be. My husband had orchestrated a journey that demanded attention, patience, and insight. He had challenged me to confront my own flaws, to recognize the impact of unspoken words, and to embrace understanding and forgiveness. And I had learned to do so not because someone demanded it, but because the lessons were embedded so thoughtfully that they guided me naturally toward revelation. By the early hours, I felt a profound sense of peace. The house, once heavy with unresolved tension, now felt alive with reflection, learning, and quiet joy. The portrait letters and photographs were no longer artifacts of grief, but instruments of connection, bridging the past, present, and future in ways I had never imagined possible. I understood now that love endures even beyond death, and that careful intention can turn absence into guidance. I whispered one last time to the portrait, "Thank you for everything. For your lessons, your patience, and your love. I will honor it." The rain tapped gently against the window, and the fan hummed in accompaniment, creating a lullaby for the heart. I felt the cycle of grief, guilt, curiosity, and understanding complete. The portrait had fulfilled its role. My husband had spoken beyond life, and I had learned the deepest truths of connection, forgiveness, and enduring love. That night, I slept more peacefully than I had in years. The house was quiet but full, the past reconciled with the present, and the portrait watched silently, content in its purpose, fulfilled. The legacy he had left wasn't just tangible, it was an enduring, invisible force shaping understanding, empathy, and love across generations. And in that understanding, I found the freedom to continue knowing that our story, though marked by absence, was complete in the most profound ways.